Welcome. I'm Kevin Miller. This is a podcast for your personal evolution. And in this episode, the education and psychology from reading an actual book. So I'm bringing back a conversation on the power of reading. Now, that's not something you haven't heard about before and aren't well aware of, but I think we forget the gravity of it. And I want to give focus to some new research I have done lately. So my conversation you're about to hear is with Jeff Brown. Jeff is the host of the Read to Lead podcast and the author of the book, Read to Lead. That's when I had him on the show. It was after he had authored that book. So as you're going to hear, we don't want to simply read, of course, and just expose ourselves to messages. We want to actually digest them and take new actions in our lives and get different results. That's the point of reading nonfiction, at least. Well, Jeff is an expert on the topic. I was really eager for the conversation. And I want to add something that I've realized and been giving focus to. So we spend so much of our day reading, but we're reading, social media, news snippets, the unrelenting amount of information all around us, but we're not digesting much of anything. Our brain is in entertainment mode. Think about your mindset when you sit down for entertainment versus the mindset when you sit down, let's say, to participate in a class. Imagine that, sitting down for a concert, some kind of entertainment, music or whatever, or going into a class and sitting down to participate. It's a completely different psychological mindset. With entertainment, your mind is turned on really for a dopamine hit. In a class, your mind is turned on to learn, to glean. It's a difference I see when we spend all day reading, again, from all these different sources around us versus when we're still and we read nonfiction book, at least, even if we're listening to it. The concept has just further elevated the importance of reading books for me. And I think you're going to be further inspired by this conversation with Jeff Brown. Hey, if you want to engage in learning with a guide, which I think more and more we just all need, I sure do, I would be honored to connect you with a guide, whether it's me or referring you to someone else who would be a good guide for wherever you need to go in your own evolution. Connect with me via email at kmiller@kevinmiller.co. All right, coming up next, I am with Jeff Brown. Again, he's host and author of Read to Lead. Let's evolve ourselves today. Jeff, the Jerry Maguire movie, You Had Me at Hello, is appropriate here because, with a book called Read to Lead, now I could sit here and espouse it and advocate it and go, yeah, man, I'm on board. But it would kind of be like, sending out a life-saving tube to a drowning person and them being really grateful because outside of my parents, which was awesome, that's all I had because I didn't do schooling. I barely made it out of high school, terrible grade point average, never stepped a foot in any formal education after that. Man, books were it for me. So anything I can claim is primarily from, my parents or books my parents had me read. And today, it's number one. You couldn't find a bigger fan for what you're doing. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And I kind of, and we'll maybe find out more why later, but I kind of envy that school experience you said you had. I sometimes wish mine were more like that.
I wasn't good with authority for one. I had some really bad school experiences. I actually went, and this isn't fair, and I apologize to anybody who teaches school in Kentucky, but at the time I was in, I think it was 49 out of 50 states in education. And man, I had, the grateful thing is I had other interests. My parents, and I had my own business as a kid and was bike racing, and I had other interests outside of that. But the focus of your book, the power of reading, I am your chiefest, I would say, fan, but also product of that. Anything I can claim again. So I'm really stoked to see the book out. What was the catalyst for you saying, man, I want to put out a tome on reading, draw people's attention to it?
It wasn't immediately obvious to me to do a book about books, about reading. I have hosted my podcast of the same name, Read to Lead, for just over 8 years. And I've been asked a lot, Kevin, Jeff, when are you going to write a book? And I never really had an answer for when or what it would be about. I was kind of stumbling along with trying to figure that out. I knew I wanted to write a book.
Yeah.
But I had no idea what that was going to be about. And honest to goodness, it took someone else coming to me, my co-author on the book, Jesse Wisniewski, saying, hey, I've got this idea for a book and I've run it up the flagpole and I haven't gotten any takers. And the pushback I keep getting is, you don't have a platform. Mm. And I said, well, what's the book idea? And he says, well, it's called The Reader's Edge, and it's right up your alley. It's espousing the benefits of intentional and consistent reading, how to make the most of this habit, why you should. And I'm like, well, there is an idea that's been under my nose all this time that had never occurred to me. And I said, I think that's a fantastic idea because I do have a platform. That's why he was coming to me. I had the thing he didn't. And so that was about 2 years ago. And 2 years ago last month, and we began working on it, and he had a literary agent. I signed with the same guy, and we started writing once we got a deal, as we obviously did. Had some writing samples in there, a proposal, a marketing plan, pretty well laid out. But once we got the deal, we got to really seriously writing, and so far it's been really, really well received. But if not for Jesse, the book might not exist.
Well, talk about being received. It's interesting when I flip the first page over. Now I've got a galley copy. I don't know if that's where it is in everybody else's copies, but to see the advocates of your book, of this focus: Seth Godin, Stephen Covey, Michael Hyatt, John Acuff, Mark Victor Hansen. I think we've had every one of those on this show. Brian Tracy and Dan Miller, my father, on there. All of them have been on this show because, we've heard that. And what I appreciate, it's not like this is new information, the power of reading, but we're missing it. And that's what I realized you guys saw, that here we are in this age. And I equate it to like health and wellness. We've never had more information, good information on how to be well. Here in America, we've never had more information. We never had more access to it. We've got the wealth of the world at our fingertips. And yet we have chronic illness and disease growing at the greatest rate ever. It makes no sense. Now, I think there are some reasons that I could point out, but you did that with reading. So here we are with the wealth of the world at our fingertips, and we're not doing it. And you talk about that, because what it brought up to me is, man, the biggest enemy of this is, I'm going to pick up a book and learn something, or can I scroll Facebook or wherever, and kind of like Simon Sinek's thing, I get a quick dopamine hit. I don't want to take that long to go deep. And there we are.
Yeah. I had a conversation with Seth Godin about this for my show. I know he's been on your show as well. And what I've realized is, by and large, I'm generalizing here, and this may not be the case for many in your audience, but as a nation, certainly, people don't want to learn. Learning requires acknowledging briefly that you don't know something, which we're taught to avoid. And it's easier to not learn, quote unquote, and get back to work. And the second thing is, people don't want to change their minds. If a book is going to help you get somewhere you've been unable to get to on your own, you're going to have to change your mind about something. And both of those things make us uncomfortable. And both of those things require, as you intimated a moment ago, us pushing out those distractions, those otherwise nice dopamine feeling type hits, and sitting down with something like a book. I think books do still matter for the sake of the brain. I think hundreds of years ago, when books first came on the scene, they helped our brains evolve to not just what we think about, but how we think in a really positive and powerful way. But then in the web age, in the internet age, in the phone in my pocket every second of the day age, those devices and the way we interact with information has undone, I would argue, some of that positive brain evolution that we went through back when books first came on the scene, unfortunately.
Well, it's interesting you say that the way that we interact with information. I pulled up a meme that I had read before I went back and found it for this show. And it was credited to being posted, just a question on Reddit. And the question was, if someone from the 1950s suddenly appeared today, what would be the most difficult thing to explain to them about today? It's an anonymous, or it shows a user, but we don't know who it is. But here's what they wrote: that I possess a device in my pocket that is capable of accessing the entirety of information known to man. I use it to look at pictures of cats and get in arguments with strangers. It's hilarious in its amazing, profound truth that here we are. I mean, I took it to my kids and said, here I am. I'm holding up. Here's my smartphone. I mean, that contains what used to have a whole building worth of computers and I can access anything. And I use it to look at, even if it's benign stuff. How long can I sit there and look, for me, at mountain bike information or woodworking stuff or even positive quotes, whatnot, but I'm still not engaging with life. So the way that we react with information. So I of course, we'll unpack that a little bit more because we are awash in information. And I would ask you to unpack it a little bit, even in regards to good information, because we know there's a lot of us, I'm going to include myself in it, that today I read, a whole book or half a book. It was awesome. It's on the New York Times bestseller list. It's a self-help book, whatever, which today would be Atomic Habits. It's at the top of the list on advice and how to. Atomic Habits by James Clear. Man, I read, half the book. I listened to 2 blogs on my commute. I did my devotion this morning. I mean, information. What are we missing, Jeff?
Well, we're missing, and oftentimes, not every time, but oftentimes we're missing the doing part, right? Yeah. It's one thing to fill your head with information, but if you're not doing anything with that information, then what good is it really doing anybody? Now, that's not to say you can't soak up some of this information just for how it impacts your thinking. Now, there's something to be said for that. Consuming this information like you just described doesn't automatically have to mean you've got a to-do list to go check off now. It can be just for how it impacts your thinking. So I often read and consume some of the information I do, Kevin, for how it impacts my thinking. Maybe it challenges my thinking. Maybe it causes me to think about something in a different and unique way. But then much of what I read personally does come with a to-do list. There are things that I want to change. There are things that I want to implement. And so I think we need to be also setting aside ample time for that. And that starts with just being intentional with your time. Dave Ramsey talks about budgets and how it's spending your money on paper before you go out and spend it for real, so you can tell your money where to go instead of wondering where it went. And I think it's necessary for us to treat our time the same way. So a la one of my mentors, who I'm pretty sure you're a fan of, a guy by the name of Michael Hyatt, taught me a long time ago the importance of an ideal week. I didn't get serious about that until just a few years ago. I've been aware of the concept for probably, as long as Michael's been talking about it, 10 plus years. But once I began starting with an ideal week and putting the big rocks in first and really analyzing with each week, in a perfect world, how would this week look once I'd lived it, and identifying what that looks like. Now, do I realize the ideal ever, if not every single time? Not very often, if I'm being honest. But unless I'm willing to identify it, I'm never going to have a snowball's chance in Hades of ever hitting it. And so I think it's important that we recognize and identify what the ideal is and then strive for that. It's not about being perfect, but what happens on the road to perfect or attempts at perfect is we find excellence, right? And so that has been the key for me. So that includes things like setting aside time for those important things. One of those important things to me is reading books. Is reading books I've specifically chosen to read because of what they might do for me, the answers they might provide. And then I protect that time just like I would any other meeting or appointment, like the meeting we're having right now.
You talking about that book, you have a section in the book, a chapter of what books should you read. That's an important one to me, though. I do want to, I'll come back to that in a second, because I do want to hit the aspect that we started off here with of really, we're talking comprehension. It's one thing to read it, as you said, and I think through osmosis, it's a benefit. If we're pumping in positive stuff all day long, not even paying attention to it, I would say, man, that is awesome. It's going to impact you. It's going to affect you positively, but it's not going super deep. And I question that we have this, talk about the information that we have these days. There's always something new. That's getting to be a bigger focus for me, a bigger concern for me. There's always something new. There's always another thing to look at. And there is nothing more enticing than that. And I have to catch myself. I get the New York, my literary agent sends the New York Times bestseller list from the Advice and How to me every week. And there's generally something new on there. And my first propensity is to go get it and I have to stop myself and say, wait, but I've got one here.
Yeah.
And I could read it in a day, but can I study it? What have I taken action on? How has it changed my life? Was it just positive entertainment? And your book has me coming back to that impetus to, am I reading the book or is it worth me studying the book? Because when I study one, some of my devotion books, I'll take a month because I'll only get 2 pages in and then I'm writing notes and thoughts and things and then I'll go and I'm not pushed to do that. But man, with these self-help books, especially, I'm so prone to just whip through it. I think people do that again with podcasting, with blogging, with what's the next one, as opposed to, I want to ask people sometimes and they'll say, okay, my goal was 52 books this year. It's one a week. And I did it. And I want to say, okay, how's your life different than it was 52 weeks ago? And it's a difficult question for most people. And it's convicting again for me. So in that, I mean, you talk about that comprehension. I don't know if you use the word study, but it feels like that's the danger is the FOMO, fear of missing out and going on to the next thing. And even I think it's bragging rights to some degree. We all want to be hip to the next thing, right?
Yeah, and I think there's an equation that we talk about in the very first chapter that kind of comes to mind as you're talking about this. And I think if you're concerned about too many shiny objects coming at you,
Sure.
or maybe you're concerned about not engaging with enough important books, I would encourage you to do this simple math exercise or equation, and that is think about how many years you got left. I mean, take your current age and subtract that from your life expectancy, and let's say that's 20 years. You got 20 years left. Let's say, how many books do you tend to read in a given year? And multiply that by the number of years you got left, and that's how many books you're likely going to read. Suddenly, depending on the length of that or the enormity or lack thereof of that number, you're going to get real serious about what's next on that list. And I would, maybe take that number, let's say it's 20, and write on a sheet of paper, or it's 20 years, and let's say you do 10 books a year, that's 200 books, right? So make a list and start filling it in with your 200 books. You don't have to do it all at once, but start adding books to that list. And suddenly you start getting real particular when you realize this is it. Yeah. this is all of them. You can do that with a lot of things in life. We're talking about doing it with books, but you could do that with a lot of different things. How many summers do I have left?
Yeah.
And then do a similar exercise. So I think that really helps you hone in on what's really important and where do I need to spend my time based on what I think I've got left on this planet.
Well, and you talked about looking for the books that are specifically chosen for you. And we are so prone, me as well, to looking at what is most popular, what is most impacting, which I'm going to give credit to. I mean, there's something to be said for that. Obviously, if people are clamoring for a book like James Clear's Atomic Habits, I'm curious as to why. I want to see, and I understand it. He wrote it really well. It's really great information, and yet there's still the question of, is it, as you just said, is that the most important priority for me? And I have learned to be a lot more filtering of the books to even see one like, another all-time bestseller in our current time right now is Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F. And I've seen the testimony to him. I think he's a smart guy. I think he's an insightful guy. But even going from the title there and on into the book, man, it's really just not, the spirit of it bothers me a little bit. Again, not a right or wrong. I don't have to make a judgment on it, but to allow myself. I guess I want people, I feel like you do that, to give people permission to look at a book and say, you know what, it may be really good, but it just doesn't quite, it's not my flavor. Man, there's enough books out there that if one is not quite your flavor, wouldn't you say just move on? You'll find something else.
Absolutely. And it's funny you mentioned that one in particular. I see that book everywhere I go. I was in a bookstore this past week looking to see if they were carrying my book, which at this time has been out about a week. And I see an end cap dedicated with nothing but books with curse words in the title.
Yeah.
It's like this whole new category of books now. And I see that book. That is a book that has been put in front of me dozens and dozens and dozens of times. And there was a time in my life when I might look at that and go, okay, that's some sort of a sign. Maybe I should pay attention to that book as often as I'm seeing it. But that's one of those for the very reasons you state. I've not opted to read at this point. Now, that may change at some point in the future. I don't know. I can't say for sure. But I've not opted to read that and books like it yet, because there are other books that, at least for me, in my point in life and what I want to do and work with and learn, and the people I want to learn from, that book's not on that list that we talked about a moment ago. It may eventually make its way on, but right now it's not on the list. And there are plenty of other books that get on there, and I might read 10 or 20 or 50 pages. It's okay to decide if the book's not doing it for you to set that down. You're not obligated to finish it just because you bought it.
And I admittedly, I do. It's on the bookshelf behind me, and I got it to see. And I did it for the same reason I look at the headlines generally daily of USA Today. Kind of see, this is the pulse, man. This is what people are participating in. And I'm curious as to what they're getting fed and why they're interested in that. But again, to look at it and go, man, if everybody's buying it, so, maybe I should. To go back to what you said, to read the book specifically chosen for you, which is an interesting, I'll bring you a concept here, Jeff, that I had not thought about until I read your book. Literally talked about it with one of my kids this morning as we were waiting in line for something. I pulled the book out and I said, here's a curious thing. And I'm going to try to be tactful because I'm not trying to be against college. But it's interesting to me that, my son brought up the term, Jeff, of active reading is what they call it apparently in high school. Because I told him, he was asking about what I was doing. I was sitting here reading your book and then taking notes, which is what I do. I read, so it comes in. I think and process something enough to spit out a question, something for us to talk about. That's what I do here. And I told him, man, I get to do this for my work. And it's so great because it helps me engage with the book. He says, oh, Dad, we call that active reading. And I thought, how interesting, especially as we looked at college, that we go there to participate in active reading. How often are you in a college class where you're going through a book, you're going through a text, you're having a teacher take you through that and, in a sense, force active reading, force you to engage with it, memorize, understand, whatever. And is that a pull for that platform? Because left to ourselves over here, we're just not as prone to proactively, intentionally do the same thing in our home, in our office.
Yeah, interesting thought. When I was in school, I did go to college reluctantly. I didn't want to go to college. I wasn't sure what I was going to study at first. But I was ready to be done with school. I did not do particularly well in school. In school, if I'm being honest, and this is no knock on teachers, some of my teachers have been some of the most impactful people in my life. My sister's a teacher and a really good one, has raised a couple of fantastic kids in the process. But school educated out of me the desire to want to read. School educated out of me the desire to want to learn, such that when I got out of school, and I've told your dad this, I was thankful all the learning was done, quote unquote. That was my attitude. Oh, I don't have to learn anymore.
Wow.
I don't have to go to school anymore. Thank goodness I don't have to do that anymore. Yeah. Well, later in life, in my early 30s now, I don't read for the better part of my 20s. I get into my 30s, and I discovered that there are books out there written by people who are experts in things that interest me. Who knew? I didn't at 33. I'm embarrassed to admit that, but I didn't know there was a Seth Godin out there. I didn't know there was a Dan Miller out there. I didn't know there was a Jim Collins and a Pat Lencioni and a Liz Weissman and on and on and on. Someone introduced me to one of those folks. Someone introduced me to Zig Ziglar in my early 20s, and I ignored it. I wasn't mature enough to, I think it was The Secrets of Closing the Sale, if I'm not mistaken, because they were suggesting that, radio sales was where the real money was at. I was in radio, not radio programming, but radio sales, and you need to understand sales. So it was Zig's book, and Og Mandino, Og Mandino book. And I wasn't mature enough at 21, 22 years old to appreciate those books. But at 33, similar books being sat in front of me, and I've since gone back and read everything Ziglar's ever written, I believe, and Mandino as well. And it was different, like the stars and planets align, and I just ate it up. And I found that, and this is the case for a lot of people, and I think even James Clear, you've mentioned his name a couple of times. I think he talks about this in Atomic Habits, or has at least tweeted about it. I can say that much. Yeah. But when you read books geared to your interests, you will never be bored. And that's okay. It's okay, because what happens is, as you read about your interests, things that excite you, things that fascinate you, you discover new interests along the way that lead you down new paths you never would have gone down were you not reading about the things you know today interest you.
You said, books written by people who are experts in things I'm interested in. That was thankfully brought to me at some point. Somebody said, do you realize this? That so often you have the opportunity to read a book that is the culmination of everything somebody took a lifetime to learn in one book. Now, obviously, we have authors who write a lot of books, but to some degree, they're talking about years of experience and learning and wisdom that they've distilled down in. And if you got a good editor, they're going to make you really distill it down in to a book that you can read in essence, a handful of hours and benefit from what it took them a lifetime to learn. And that was so convicting to me again on the opportunity I have. And there's you probably know, what's the old quote that if you read 3 to 5 books on a certain topic, you're an expert, right? You remember that one? Arguable, but
yeah, the studies, the most recent studies I've read, and some of these are in the book, you read one book on a topic, you know more than 27% of the population on that topic. You read 5 books on a topic, and I think it jumps to 50 or 60% or somewhere in that range. You read 10 books on a particular topic, and you now know more than 95% of the general population. Now, I would argue as to whether or not that makes you an expert. You know more about the topic, but I think until you start putting into action what you've learned, and developing wisdom, you're probably not a true expert yet, if we're being technical. But reading about those things is a critical first step. And again, by reading about them, you're doing something that the majority of the public is not doing, which by itself, before you even get to the doing, gives you a tremendous edge in life and in business and in work and career.
It's interesting because it almost brings to the surface if you have a problem. So everybody go out there and make a list. What are your biggest problems? What are your top 3 problems right now? What are the things most troubling to you? And you can take it the other way. The things you most desire, the most passionate thing you want, whichever way speaks to you. I know that Tom Ziglar has talked a lot about the study that they did on goals versus problem solving. And I think it was 80% of people really resonate more with problem solving than they do goals, even though the end is still the same. Here's something I want to achieve. It fulfills a desire or it solves a problem. So when we list those out, what are those top ones? What a great question. Man, that's interesting. So how many books have you read on that specific issue? I feel like that's what I can do to myself. I can do to, with my kids, and we can do now here to the audience. Say, what have you done that? Because I think as a culture, we know that we're more prone to complain and lament than to say, man, here you go for nothing. You can go to the library for free, or you can go online. I don't know what the average price. I don't know audiobooks. I don't do those at all. But the average price of most of the books that I buy is $15, $20. I don't know if that's fair, but for such a low cost, to go back to what you said, if I read 10 books and knew 95%, maybe I'm not an expert, 95%, and we're talking, to under $200. You can't touch a licensure, certification, a degree with that.
Yeah. And it's funny, disliking school as much as I did, when I got a chance then a few years later to create my own curriculum via books.
Yeah.
It was a completely different story. That to me was a fascinating idea. And so when it came time for me to recognize that there was a skill I needed to learn in the job that I was at the time, or in my business since then, a skill I needed to learn to better run my business or to launch a new product or service or whatever it might happen to be, I began collecting books and making a list on books that are going to help me solve that problem. As you mentioned a moment ago, when you've got a problem that you need to solve, chances are 99 times out of 100, somebody's already solved it. And chances are, again, someone's also written a book about it.
Yeah.
That manifested itself to me early in my career, back in the radio days when I first started reading and I began experimenting with what I was learning, things that I wanted to understand to help the company grow, and skills I needed to be a part of that process and make myself a more valuable employee. Kevin, as I began experimenting with some of these things, the things I tried that did not work were quickly forgotten. It's interesting how that works. The things that I tried that did work got me noticed. And that led to me being asked to then present to other departments within the company nationwide on the things that I was learning, the things that I was experimenting, and the ones that were successful. Well, I had never really done public presentations before. And I was suddenly being asked to do that throughout the company. And so I began creating a curriculum for me on public speaking, and I niched it down. I started with presentation design, because I thought, if I feel good about my slides, I'll be more confident when I give my talks, and maybe they'll be staring at those instead of staring at me, and that'll make me less nervous.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't do it that way today, but that's where I started. And then I went to presentation structure and presentation delivery, and how to get over the fear of public speaking, and more recently, how to get booked and paid to speak, and how to inject humor into your talks. There's all these different subcategories within a category like that, public speaking, and you can create your own curriculum, starting with as little as 3 to 5 books in each one of those subcategories, to the point that as you exercise these things you're learning over time, you do become a true expert in that thing.
I love that line, creating my own curriculum. It makes me think of homeschooling. I always say we, and need to clarify, my wife primarily has homeschooled kids throughout the years, and that's what they do, create their own curriculum. So she'll look at, gosh, here's the regular curriculum. I think that's irrelevant for you guys. I don't think you need that. Let's find what we think is relevant. That's the beauty of homeschooling as opposed to public school, where you don't have as much choice to create your own curriculum. So the thought of, who do I want to be? What do I want to be capable of? I get to create my own curriculum. On that topic, though, of coming back to what I said about, if we go to, let's say, formal education, to pick on that somewhat, it is helpful. A benefit is you are then forced, required, held accountable to that active reading, to actually participating, not just read it. You got to know this stuff. So that's a benefit of that. You don't get to pick the curriculum. You don't have the flexibility that I like, but that is a benefit of that. Over here, if I'm going to do it on myself, am I disciplined enough to figure out what I need and then to engage with it? And it reminded me, as I was thinking about it, Jeff, of self-employment. And I know even amongst my kids, I've got some that, all I know is self-employment. That's all I've ever done. And I'll never forget one of my kids saying, he said, at least at this time in life, Dad, I just want someone to tell me when to show up and tell me what to do. It's so much responsibility. I'm struggling with being accountable to myself and making myself go do X, Y, Z. And so I'm going to go get a job. I know I'm not making as much per hour. And I'm so grateful that they had that awareness and that they have that, and that they're going forth, with that. But there's another reality that if I want to become an expert in, what's a field that doesn't require, I was gonna say accounting, but often to do that, you do have to have a degree. What's a subject where I could say, good, I could go to college. They create the curriculum. They take me into it. They force me to engage or require me to engage. As opposed to over here where I have to do it. I said have to or get to. There's a big, there it is right there. Do I want the responsibility? Maybe that's a fair, benign statement. The responsibility of creating my curriculum and getting myself to engage with it.
Well, yeah, to me, it's an easy decision to make. The thing is we often will put off those hard things. There's sacrifice that comes with self-discipline and growth, right?
Yeah.
And that sacrifice is hard. And so what we do is we put that off because of the pain involved. But what we don't recognize when we do that is there is another pain that comes later. Eventually, it's called the pain of regret.
Yeah.
So, we can have pain now that comes with sacrifice and growth, or we can have the pain later that comes with regret. I'd rather have the growth and the knowledge gained now, even though that might be a hard thing, and not have the regret later if it's up to me.
Absolutely. And, with this, you bring us back to the point of it's one thing to read, it's another thing to learn. And that is so simple, so base, so elementary, so pithy. And yet you brought me back to that as a core focal point. Am I reading or am I learning? And we were doing some kind of a personality profile recently, and it kind of nailed me on being the kind of person where you and I can be looking face to face. You can be talking to me. I can be looking in your eyes. I can be nodding. I can even say, gosh, yeah, whatever. And I'm not listening at all. And you'll finish. And if you ask me, so what do you think? And I do that. It's not as funny as it used to be, but I'll have to just admit to my wife, to my kid, whatever, I'm so sorry. I did that to a counselor recently. And she then put it back to me. I said, I'm so sorry. I was not listening at all. I was still thinking about the last thing that you said. And I'm writing letters in my head. That I can do that with reading. I can do that. I can read it. And again, back to what you said, through osmosis, there's some osmotic, can I say that? Benefit to that. But am I really learning? And then am I the kind of person, I think, to come back, I like the concept of saying, I'm the kind of person who does X. I like being an athlete. I'm the kind of person who does athletic stuff. I'm the kind of person who works out. I like that. Am I the type of person? Am I a learner? Is that just a part of my label or not? That's pretty stark right there to ask, isn't it?
Yeah, I think something that can help with regard to retention and comprehension as well is to be very intentional. Back to that word again.
Yeah.
When it comes time to read, and for me, it looks like this, and these are some things we talk about in the book as well, is I've got a reading chair dedicated to that task. Find a place in your home, preferably in a room that has a door that you can close, that you can dedicate to reading, or at least that's a place that you can shut off and get out of everybody else's way. I like to put on a pair of noise canceling headphones. My warning to you, and I learned this the hard way, be sure everybody else in the house knows you're wearing them. Otherwise, they'll be shouting your name and wondering why you're not responding.
Yeah.
And then I'll connect that. Though the phone is not in the same room with me, I'll connect the noise canceling headphones with an app like Focus at Will that plays sort of ethereal type music without a real melody or lyrics and allows me to do just that, focus. Or an app like Adagio, which is an app that allows you to search classical music based on mood. And I'll connect to one of those and have those low volume in my headphones, and then I set a timer, and it's usually 25 minutes. Sometimes if I'm feeling ambitious, it might be as much as 50 minutes, so a la the Pomodoro technique, right? But usually 25 minutes. And I'll simply read as much as I can in that time and not worry about whether it was a whole chapter or a whole section, but read what I can read. Because I think that's the important thing. When you set aside time to read, don't beat yourself up if you didn't read as much as you had hoped you'd read. Just answer the question, did I use that time to read? Did I do this thing I said I was going to do? And I think that's the main goal you need to strive for. Now, if I haven't finished a chapter yet in that time, I'll set it aside, take that 5-minute break, come back, set another 25-minute timer, and finish where I left off. And it's later than it's in the next session, if that follows immediately, where I'm taking notes. All I've allowed myself to do in those reading times, oftentimes, is just make markings. Things that I'm going to come back to later, like an asterisk for something that's important, a question mark for things I maybe don't understand or possibly not even sure I agree with, and then maybe a cue for a particularly pithy quote or something the author said that I thought was well written. And that's all I do. I come back later, and now I'm just going to take notes based on those markings that I made. Go back to those. And when I write my notes, Kevin, this is key. I'm writing them as if I'm writing for someone else, and preferably for someone else who has not read what I just read.
Interesting.
And so that forces me to have to really synthesize it down. Because the reality is, future you that comes back to these notes 6 months from now is someone else. You're a different person. You've grown. You've done this thing. You've done that thing. You're coming back to these notes in a few weeks, a few months. You need to understand them out of context as if you were not the person who wrote them. If you'll write your notes that way, then you'll get a whole lot more out of them when you do come back to them. And it's important to understand, too, that you need to log and schedule times that you're going to come back to these notes. Otherwise, you'll take notes and they'll just sort of disappear in the ether, and you'll never go back to them or do anything with them.
Okay, that was worth the price of admission for me right there. Really, because I do. So I've gotten into the habit really recently. I used to read a book and I'd have a journal next to me, and I cannot tell you why, but I've gotten into the habit now of taking a book and I underline things that stand out to me. I actually bought these, here, hold on. Here, I'm holding it up for the video. I bought a whole box of these narrow or thin wooden bookmarkers. It's got a hole so you can put a, feather on it or something like that, I guess. But I use it as my bookmarker because now it's a solid line and I can underline it, which I am the least OCD person you'll ever meet. But I'm so messy that I find myself underlining stuff, and I scratched up through the writing. Now I can't read the dumb thing. So I use this little thing. So I underline it, but then I'll go into the back of the book in the empty pages, which I love the empty pages. A lot of times these days, sometimes they won't have them anymore, but I love the empty pages. I'll put the page number and I'll put the thought. But I like what you said, Jeff, that you are, because it reminded me of Zig. Zig Ziglar, that was his thing. He said, I read every day. He said, I read 3 hours a day. This is his mantra, 3 hours a day. And I read with the intent of having something to impart to others. That's what I just heard you say, that you are writing notes to yourself that you could, in essence, impart to others or impart to yourself. I'm going to adopt that. Instead of just writing the thought, because I'll kind of hit the highlight, blah, blah, blah. To say, how would I say this to impart it back to me or to someone else? That's powerful chemistry.
Well, that's great to hear. What you're doing is essentially is you're writing it in such a way that you're preparing yourself to teach it to someone else were you to need to. And I think just that act of, even if you get to that point, and I often do that, I'll find myself in mastermind groups and other settings, book clubs, teaching what I've learned from a book that I've just read. And that the act of doing that too forces you to truly synthesize it so that anyone can understand it. And it forces you to put it into your own words and share it from your own heart. So that teaching process is wonderful when it comes to retention and comprehension.
So I guess from a mechanics standpoint, we need to talk about audio versus a physical book. I am, admittedly, I want a paper. I want the paper in my hands. I pretty much 99% of the time I require it. If I'm going to have somebody on the show who's got a book, which I almost always do, I want it in my hands because, well, I guess that's the question. Is my because even valid? I just say, historically, I do think that I struggle with auditory processing. I wonder if I really have a legitimate, labeled issue with that. However, because I don't like it, I also don't participate with it that much. I just do read it. So it's a muscle I'm not also working out at all. So I've just gone fully over here to the visual. But I wonder, and I was thinking about it as you talked, I wonder if part of that too is when I have the book in hand and my little my little bookmark to underline and a pen, I'm fully engaged. If I'm listening, then my eyes are able to go elsewhere. And wherever my personally, Kevin Miller, wherever my eyes are is where my attention is. And that's a struggle for me. So if I had to listen to something auditorially, which once in a while I do, if I'm going to really pay attention, you talked about noise canceling headphones. Sometimes I need to shut my eyes and I have to stop it constantly. I have to stop it and take notes. We can't do that. how do I say this and be kind to the people who are doing audiobooks as they do 100 million things, because maybe they're really good at auditory comprehension. But for me, man, I'm gone. How do you reconcile the audio versus physical?
Yeah, and it goes back to something you were talking about earlier with regard to your son and active listening. I think a physical book, for some of the reasons you stated, cannot be interacted with unless it's actively. I mean, with a physical book, you have to interact with it in an active way. You can't not do that. But with an audiobook, you can get away with engaging with it passively, just hearing it, and your eyes are doing it like you said. And so to me, that is one of the reasons why I far prefer, like you, a physical book, because I know a physical book is going to force me to actively engage with the book. I'm having to use my eyes and my brain and my ears, in a sense that I'm sort of reading it out aloud, or in my mind anyway. So in one sense, you could argue that. Now, if for your season in life right now, and this was the case for me at one point, if you believe your only option for reading is to leverage, say, your commute time, if you have one, in this day of Delta and COVID, and you can only leverage that time to read, then some reading or listening to audiobooks is better than nothing at all. So I wouldn't discount that entirely, especially if that's the only option you feel like you have. But I believe that there's something magical that happens with physical books, much like the studies that show that, writing notes or anything else by hand does wonders for retention and comprehension versus were you typing those same things on a keyboard. And I think there's something special that happens when you read a physical book, even versus an ebook, let alone an audio book. And there's something spatially happening in the way the brain engages with a book that has two sides, right? There's a left-hand page and there's a right-hand page. And as I'm reading along and I go, that the author mentioned something about this earlier, let me go back to that. Your brain instantly remembers, well, where was that on the page? Top, middle, bottom. Which side of the book was that on? Left, right. And so we engage with a book so much more actively, so much more differently than we do a physical book, than we do any of those other kinds.
Well, and maybe it depends again on what you're doing. I'm thinking about this as you talk and describe it, that we're talking about the aspects of, again, we're calling it active reading. I was just on a road trip and I was sitting there doing my driving, and my wife was over here listening to a book, an audio book. But there's nothing. We were out in the middle of Colorado where there's not in the mountains. There's nothing to look at. And so she was able to do that. She could pause it. She could take notes. And I would say, man, that's right on par, for the most part. But yeah, if you're doing that while you're actively doing other things, even driving where you got to pay attention, it's got to degrade somewhat your comprehension. Again, so don't have to say better, best, right, wrong, whatever. But the point is, can you come out the other end comprehending, learning, and having something to take action on? So we've talked a lot about, obviously, the value or some of the how-tos here and some of the values, of books. Now, we can't do your book justice at all because you go through so many profound values of this. But a couple of them really stood out to me. And one was getting the context of somebody else's perspective, one from the author, but I also really like, and actually, Jeff, I'll tell you that this, I made a decision on a venture, a group that I'm putting together. Actually, it's an online private community I'm going to be putting together for my audience that we're just about to launch. And I went back this morning after reading your book and added in there, because I hadn't made it specific, in essence, a book group that we're going to go through 1 to 2 books per month together. Because in looking at your book, I realized, okay, I get the perspective of the other person, the writer, I'm sorry. I get this perspective. But how about getting the perspective of other people reading this book, other peers, people on the same journey? I get to do this, with my wife some, with my business partner and best friend, Dr. Randy James. We do that a little bit. But I don't spend a whole lot of time really doing that, to go through a book like this, read to lead, to go through this. Hey, how about 100 of us, or however many it is, let's go through this, make it a thread, and really talk about the issues. How is this difficult to implement? Or, man, I had some thoughts for this, or I disagree with that, whatever it may be, to expand that. That's what the written book gives us. You talk about the power of groups, and I think that just the context that we get from hearing others' perspectives.
Yeah, and I've had book clubs of my own in the past, and one of the reasons why I started my podcast was because I needed and wanted more people around me to talk about the books I was reading.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I'll surround myself with a podcast audience, and we'll talk about the books that I'm reading together. And hey, I get to talk to the authors too. That's pretty cool. So for me, all of that, everything that I created back then when the podcast first launched, especially, was all about surrounding myself with other people whom I could talk with about the books that I was reading. I think that's pivotal. That's key. Even whether that's one-on-one, whether that's maybe in a meeting at work, you taking over and being the person who leads the discussion of a particular book, assuming, if you're not the person in charge, the person in charge is okay with that. Or with your own team, if you're an entrepreneur and running your own company, or maybe even look for evangelists on your staff who might have a love for this and who would relish the opportunity to be the person who leads a book club in your workplace for you, and can take the lead on that. I think that any opportunity to do those kinds of things with groups of people and get those other insights is a great idea.
Well, I have not been doing that, and I'm going to start. Two other key points I want to land on here, Jeff, that you pulled out in your book that just stuck out to me: creativity and communication. I find people in my audience, your audience, what I call an aspiring crowd, the kind of people who are going to read a book like Read to Lead and who are going to listen to the Ziglar Show, they want creativity. They want to be more creative. And I think we as a culture are suffering more and more each day with an inability to communicate well. And we see so many of our problems due to poor communication skills and abilities, and even just the influx of really bad communication, negative communication. But if I take those two captive, tell us your perspective, tell me your perspective on where you see reading helping us be more creative.
Well, and I think this even extends to not just nonfiction, which we've mostly talked about, but also fiction.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks.
I don't read a lot of fiction personally, if I'm being honest. But the regardless of the situation you're in, whether you run your own company or you're a leader in a company or work for someone else, the soft skills are where it's at, right? Not everybody wants to admit that.
You. Yeah.
But the soft skills are where it's at. And reading is going to help you immensely with these soft skills. I mean, think about reading a novel. Think about the relationships, the characters, the empathy you're going to develop for people who are different than you that you're reading about, things of that nature. So those are critical, reading books like that. I have made it a point recently to read books about Theodore Geisel, Dr. Seuss, George Lucas, Jim Henson, all three of which written by the same author, by the way, a guy named Brian J. Jones. People who I view as creative. And I want to understand how their brain works and how they came to the decisions that they did. And so biographies are a great way to foster creativity. It doesn't have to be about people creating movies and Muppets and children's books necessarily. It can be biographies about, Ben Franklin or Steve Jobs or what have you. And then as you read and as you comprehend more and read more and more difficult, even books, that's naturally, without you even having to think about it, that is naturally going to lead into better communication. It's going to increase your vocabulary. You're going to learn new concepts you didn't previously know, new words and phrases and ideas you didn't previously know. And just by default, without you even realizing it, that's going to improve your communications. Reading books about these types of things we've talked about, creativity and empathy and relationships and novels and things of that nature, is going to impact your relationships tremendously, because all of it collectively is going to make you a better human being. And again, it'll be in ways you won't immediately recognize or won't be even immediately aware of. They'll just be there because you've spent your time doing something that's truly valuable and truly impacting your brain in the end.
It's interesting that you mentioned that about fiction. I have in the past probably 2 years, one of my best buddy, Randy James, got me, because he was constantly talking about this latest fiction book that he would read at night before he went to bed. And he started handing them off to me. And I just had gotten out of that, right? I'm in personal development. We don't read that fiction junk. And so he kept giving me these books, and I love it. It is one of my greatest joys. I literally am in a time right now where I've had a bunch of great books. I haven't watched something on a screen like at night at home in, I can't remember, probably 3 weeks or so, which I love a good movie. Absolutely love a good movie.
Yeah.
But it feels so hard to find something that can hold my interest these days and that has any redeeming value or makes me feel or think or whatever. But the books are good. And so fiction books, I really appreciate. So I just read, because it was so stinking popular, I was curious about that. Where the Crawdads Sing, or I think that's what it is. Where the Crawdads Sing. The book's 3 years old, sold 10 million copies, has like 187,000 reviews on Amazon. And where Crawdads Sing. That's it. I just looked it up. So I just read it. And it's real interesting because it showcases just what some of what you just talked about, the ability to learn so much just from the books, because it depicts this girl who lives out in the marsh, totally pretty much on her own. I don't want to give the book away, spoiler for everybody. And what happens to her by the end of the book, primarily as a result of reading, that is not the focus of the book. This is character development and intrigue and drama and whatever. That's not it. But that is it'd be interesting to you if you haven't read it, Jeff, because it's through reading that she becomes, I don't want to spoil it for anybody. But I look at that and I think that's profound to me. Again, you're hearing my personal bias because I give so much credit to books for anything I've ever achieved, because that's what I've had. Books and people, but I have, again, no formal education. And my kids, I'm so grateful. Maybe the best parenting thing I ever did is somehow I got them to be all voracious readers. I have one kid who was at a private school, and he not only beat the most read list a little bit, he beat it by it was over 2 times as much as the person ever in the history of the school, even in the high school and whatever. And he was just a little guy. But more than that, back to what is he comprehended it. And the stuff that I hear my kids come out with, I'm thinking, you did not hear that from me. You did not learn that from me, especially if it's one of the homeschool kids. You didn't learn that from us or through your, where on earth? And they'll cite some book. And often, Jeff, it's a fiction book, but it exposed them to somebody's thoughts and ideas and creativity. I mean, in all reality, Jeff, I don't know. Yeah, James Clear's book on habits is it's the hottest thing in personal development right now. I would be, if I could wave a magic wand, I'd love to see your book being read as much that, because I think we're suffering for a lack of reading and engaging. I'll just tell you this, I will be espousing this book. I know there's certain books that come along. There's nobody I've ever had on the show as a guest who's had a bad book. I wouldn't have them on the show, and I read their book. But it's interesting, even as I do that as time goes on, that I find myself relating back to that book again and again and again. And I know now I'll be relating back to this book because it's so, again, I think so needed, so powerful. And it's so read to lead. It feels like, isn't this elementary? But it's not. It's the common sense. It's not common anymore. You've got to be getting those testimonials.
Yeah, to a large degree, you're right. Yeah, they're starting to come in now that the book has been out for a few days. And it's certainly intended to be an evangelical tool for people like you and me to be able to hand to that person who maybe isn't convinced of that yet. In fact, we spend the first 4 chapters making an argument. But there's much of the book, the second 2/3, I would add, is for anyone in any category. If you're someone who wants to get more out of the books you read, if you want to do some of the things we talked about, like better comprehend, better retain what you read, or turn your reading into more of a habit, you'll find keys to those things as well.
Well, and I'm seeing that. I just pulled you guys up in Amazon. Yeah, this book came out, published available August 31st, and we're at September 8th. So not long there, and you guys got great rankings already, great reviews. I need to put my own review in there as well.
Oh,
And thank you. I'm so grateful to my father, Dan Miller, for advocating to have you on here. And this is one. I told you I had John Acuff on the show yesterday. We recorded yesterday with his book Soundtracks, and I told him, man, this is one I want my kids to read. This is another one, so I'm gonna have to get some more copies here, and I want to pass it around with my kids, because there are few things from an education standpoint, maybe nothing, that I believe in more than the power that we all have at hand to read. So thanks for writing the book. Thanks for being here and giving us your time today, Jeff.
Kevin, I so appreciate the invitation. Thank you so much. Thank you to your dad for making the introduction. I had a great time, and appreciate all you've done for the book.
Well, friends, thanks for joining us in this discussion. Again, that is Jeff Brown, and wherever you're listening to this, you can find him. Read to Lead is his podcast, and his book as well is called Read to Lead. If you want to check in with guidance for you, personal guidance, which I am just more and more focused on these days, getting it for myself and helping others, going from talk about knowledge to actual learning, just like we talked about in this show, going from entertainment to actually a class, guidance, training, teaching. Connect with me. kmiller@kevinmiller.co is my email. I'd be honored to see where you need and can get some guidance. Until next time, here's to the evolving you.
Yeah.